So let me begin the questions, actually. I think I just heard Dr. Conway say that 250 individuals is something like a number to talk about for a viable population. And you even commented saying maybe not that's enough.
Actually, some geneticists will tell you 10,000. And there's been a lot of new recent work suggests that those numbers are actually much more constrained than that 10,000, and that there's a great deal of species specificity here.
Kevin Murphy, what would you have said?
Are you looking for extinction avoidance, or are you looking for multiple populations to self-sustain over parts of their range?
Yes.
Because that is, conservation biologists would debate that point, and in fact, Redford and a whole bunch of colleagues from WCS have that vision as what conserving a vertebrate really means is not just avoiding extinction. It means populations, self-sustaining populations, demographically, genetically, across their range or parts of their range.
Okay, their
So I
range,
can't answer your question.
their natural range aside, the issue that informs my question is one that's on the minds of half the people here. Is our zoo-based species survival plans viable enterprises?
Ask the black-footed ferrets. The number's 18.
And I think it depends on your benchmark for genetic diversity too. I'm not a geneticist, but we've got this super high benchmark of 90%.
So I know that this is, a question that, first, a black-footed ferret is a great answer, Dr. Bonner, it's a great answer, and so is yours, Kevin. But, I mean, this is the question at hand. One of the questions at hand is whether or not the zoo-based species survival plans are a reasonable enterprise and whether they will or should be part of the future of zoos. Dr. Fernandez.
Well, it depends on the generation time, the number of individuals that you need. A really long-lived species, you can get away with fewer because you're going to retain those genes for, if it's tortoises, you don't have to worry about keeping more than, 25, and you've got a good founder population for another 100 years. If it's mice, you need a lot more. So I do think that there's not like one set answer for that. But there are opportunities that I think all zoos have to participate at different scales, depending on the size of the zoo, the kinds of species that they could get these involvement with. I mean, we specialize in some local species that we can do on our scale. Other zoos have the capacity to be involved with much larger conservation.
Bill Conway.
The fundamental point I was speaking to is that for most larger species, you cannot maintain a viable population in a zoo unless you're dealing with a lot of zoos. And if you do work with parks and reserves, and you have a population such as they're developing in St. Louis and elsewhere with some of these species and some of the points that Monica's made, if you're working with a sizable park, you can maintain a really big population over time. And that is really not a problem that you can talk about without being very specific about place and species. And as was said, generation time and everything else, it's not a simple question.
Jeff Bonner.
Yeah, I think following on Bill's comment about extractive reserves, you really have to go back and look at the fact that it's the knowledge, the techniques, the technology, the skill set that's developed from maintaining animals in human care that ultimately makes it possible to run an extractive reserves or manage a small population, to do translocation, which is going to be critically important in the future. All that said, we're facing the largest extinction since the age of dinosaurs with the loss of amphibians. 250 odd accredited zoos. I just rounded that number up a little bit. If they each took 12 species, you're looking at saving all 3,000 critically endangered frogs in the spine of the Americas. Now, you don't have to keep them for so long. What we could do is breed back, we know we could, a resistance to chytrid. The question is then becomes an ethical one, are you really allowed to do that? I would say, yes, we caused the problem. We could solve the problem. We could reintroduce them all, and in that instance, conservation breeding or captive breeding could be 100% successful for an entire taxa, with, by the way, without spending much money. So as Bill said, it's really a function of what taxa you're talking about, more than anything else.
Just for clarification, species survival plans were not developed to sustain the wild populations. They were developed to sustain the captive populations, and we're still struggling with that. They potentially are part of a strategy for wild populations, but just so everyone's clear on that, they were about maintaining zoo populations with, at this point, as we saw earlier from Jeff's slide, very mixed success. But that's not a wild animal strategy. We're still looking at many, many strategies.
That's actually how I meant the question, and
Yeah.
so thank you for that clarification. Monica?
What may be interesting in this context, I was discussing this with John yesterday, was that we may not need to preserve the live animal in the future, but just its genetics, and may be able to introduce the DNA of a wild animal whenever is needed. So maybe in the future the populations need not be that large to preserve certain genetics.
Very, very creative. Catherine Doyle?
Actually, the message I'm hearing here that actually kind of begs the question of, what is the role of the SSP? Because I'm hearing that there are breed and release programs, releasing back to wild populations, but also that maybe some zoos would just want to keep the diversity of their collections and not focus on the breed and release or the crisis situations. So then does the SSP evolve into the future then to maybe serve some zoos differently than others?
So I sort of steered the topic first to SSPs, but we just received a variety of points of view on this notion of conservation, and I invite the panel to comment on any of the aspects of anything that was presented.
One of the things I wanted to touch on was Kevin's point that we are losing a lot of husbandry expertise, and we can't always anticipate what will the crisis be, and it might be something that is very common, that we readily bred in zoos and we stopped breeding and suddenly there's a major catastrophe, and that knowledge would have been there had it not been that we chose to cycle out of that species, and it became one that was recommended for managed to extinction. So it is something that I worry about as well, is if we get too focused, we can't anticipate the future, and we should try to maintain a certain familiarity with a lot of these things. And just helping with, if there is one of these crises where we want to breed in at the very last minute before they go extinct, maybe the expertise to have done that was lost 20 years ago. I mean, we're moving out of a lot of primates that we used to have great experience with. We're moving away from all of the, when I was on WCMC, all of the reports that we were preparing for the regional collection plans was really picking and choosing what we thought we could do, and a lot of the zoo species that were common 30 years ago are basically being managed to extinction.
John Coe.
A lot of these questions and answers have been sort of framed in the context of a steady state, that the the emergency of wildlife is continuing at a rapid rate, but everything else is normal. So I'm wondering what zoos have prepared, or other wildlife officials have prepared for, quick reaction rescue teams. Massive floods wipe out a vast area. You got to get in there and get what you can. What are the ethics involved? What are the politics involved? Or do you just let them wash away? Or, civil unrest boils over the border into Miramar National Park, and suddenly the tigers are threatened. What are the issues around those kinds of critical, time-sensitive emergencies as compared to long-term strategies?
Bill Conway.
Well, the only reason I dare to answer that impossible question is because I'm very much involved with the funding of conservation. And I'm afraid that you've asked a question that has no answer. We can't fund right now emergency, much less the emergencies we can imagine are going to happen next year. So it would be wonderful to have lots of extra money to get the World Bank, GEF perhaps, and the UNDP to set aside major funds for this particular animal community and that particular animal community. But considering the levels of human poverty and the stress in the world economic system at the present time, I think that would be very optimistic.
Jesse Donahue.
I have a question for Monica. One of the group of animals that you had in your list that were going to remain in zoos were gorillas, which interested me because it looks like the trend right now is to give gorillas rights, large apes rights, similar to the kinds of rights that children have, for example. So I'm curious, have you thought about that at all in terms of, and particularly some of this is coming from Europe, so I'm wondering, they're ahead of us on that, so I'm wondering if you've thought about that at all.
I was more thinking about, I was kind of inspired by recent research on the perception of the endangerment of chimpanzees in the US. And the article that mentioned this research was kind of complaining about that this may be a wrong perception. People perceive gorillas and orangutans as endangered, but not chimpanzees because you can see them on TV all the time. So conservationists, of course, will say, this is wrong, this is a wrong perception. But we can also say, well, maybe it's right, the perception is right, there will be chimpanzees because there is an interest, there's a commercial interest in having chimpanzees. It's not going to be a certain subspecies of chimpanzees, it's going to be a kind of domesticated hybrid chimpanzee. And I was just thinking the same may happen for gorillas. And giving apes rights, I think on a global scale, is a minority program.
There's a question from the audience that is relevant here. I think that you may have already given the answer in part or implied it. But in a future, imagine a future in which a certain species is extinct in the wild and that there is no reasonable opportunity for or prospect for reintroduction. Would it be ethical, acceptable, or even ethically obligatory to maintain their population in captivity, or would it be unethical to maintain them only in captivity for, to perpetuate them only to a life of captivity? Monica.
I like this question about captivity. I would like to question the term captivity at all. I mean, how much choice does an animal or even a human need to be called non-captive?
Bill Conway.
Monica's opened a delightful question. If you work in nature, excuse me, I said Monica opened a really delightful question. If you work in nature, as many of us do, as I do from time to time, and you are watching what is happening to wild animal populations. For example, I'm working with a large penguin colony in an area called Monte Leon in southern Argentina, way down on the coast of Patagonia. A group of pumas moved in and began killing them, as many as 3,000 a month. Not eating them, killing them. I went down there and did studies with park people in 2009, and I found that they were really not eating more than 1 in 8 or 9. But they brought them all together in piles. And with tracks in one thing or another, I was able to determine that there was a male, a female, and 3 cubs. And we confirmed that later with a helicopter. We worked with the local rangers who were very good. We put up some cameras, we recorded the whole thing, and then we came to the point, okay, we know the rate of killing We know who did it, the murderers. We know they weren't there in 2007 or ever before, as we knew. But now they are. What do we do? What does the national park system do? What does the national park system in Costa Rica do because the jaguars are killing the female green turtles? These female turtles, before they even nest, have to be 24, 25 years old. Now we're going to have more and more problems of this kind, and we will have a great many very sensitive people saying, oh, you can't kill that puma, that jaguar, or God forbid, that tiger. But the amount of killing these big predators are doing in animals that in some cases are in reduced numbers makes it a conservation question of great difficulty.
Kevin Murphy.
I wanted to respond to Jess's question about if a species is extinct in the wild. Golden frogs, Panamanian golden frogs, that's essentially what happened to them. They were collected prophylactically in 99 and 2000, great founding stock, brought into zoos. Scientists knew that this fungus was going to blow into Central America, wipe them out. They predicted it correctly. There haven't been formal studies, but pretty much they're functionally extinct. Certainly at least two populations of one race are. So now zoos have this sustainable population. It is a green SSP. It is absolutely sustainable if we manage them properly. I absolutely think it's ethically appropriate. The reason for zoos' existence is for conservation education. So if we can show these wonderful frogs to people and make them care, I mean, that's a fundamental goal of ours. I don't know that I share Jeff's optimism that we can make them resistant to chytrid, and perhaps there are too many genetic or phenotypic changes that are happening in captivity and they'll be too weak to go back. I would worry about those things if the range of time is too long, but we have them in a genetically viable way that we could put them back if we ever were able to.
Donna Fernandez.
I love a lot of 1950s science fiction, and whenever they have the dooming destruction of the human race and there's a ship that's leaving to colonize another planet, there's usually not a shortage of people looking to get on that ship. So I think that if we have the opportunity to save 20, 40, 50, whatever, for as long as we can, I think it's a good responsibility, even if we don't necessarily know what the final outcome will be, because once they're gone forever. And frankly, if I were given a ticket on that ship, I'd want to be on it. I wouldn't want to say, no, let us go extinct. I don't think any of us should get on that ship.
John Fraser.
I think, Monica, you started us down a really interesting road with your conversation about semi-wild. And I think that it's starting to get, the conversation today is getting to a place where we're thinking practically, that we have to move beyond the crisis thinking, because these individual responses are taking space, whether it's small for a toad or something larger, and in effect, we have not done enough triage or reasoning as an industry. But I think by 50 years from now, we will be much more familiar, because of the scale of crisis that we'll be seeing, at thinking in terms of triage, hope, and practical solutions that can be dealt with on the cycle that we can live inside. I do think Jeff's hope that we could really solve the amphibian crisis if we don't think about it as a zoo's problem, but as the zoo as just a focal place for a community. If we were to say in some communities in America, an amphibian for every parish, and the zoo is the coordinator, but not the actual frog pod in every, we don't need 65 frog pods in a zoo. What we need is 65 frog pods in people's parking lots. That this is a cultural issue, and if the zoo itself in the future does not see itself as the center institution focal point that's sending its 3 people with boots down to grab a critter, but really is coordinating a community's reasoned response to preservation, conservation, or possibly, and I think this is, John, your word, adaptation, because the planet... Accommodation, okay. The planet is changing at such a radical speed that those animals wouldn't get reintroduced to where they came from in the first place. We have to recognize that the Sahara will be grasslands. we have to recognize that rainforests are going to become grasslands or deserts very quickly in our lifetimes. And so the kind of scale we're talking about means that zoos need to start working as a community resource, not thinking as if we're the only people that can save a critter.
Jeff Ewell.
Thanks for that. Also, one of the things that I think is important for us to start thinking about in terms of crisis-oriented thinking and triage is that with elevated extinction rates, we're going to be put in a position where not all organisms can be preserved. And as someone who studies extinctions, this is something that I give a lot of thought to. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the issue of, imagine that something like the golden frog had been close to extinction, but let's say hypothetically as a thought experiment that it was amazingly, for no fault of our own species. We didn't do it. It wasn't because of rising sea levels, because of global warming or anything like that. It's just, it was a small population alongside a volcano, and when the volcano was going to erupt, what next? That would be it. Are we more or less ethically bound to try to preserve that species than we would had it been a species that was under threat because of our actions directly or indirectly?
Please, Keith Winston.
I want to take that for a second and maybe a twist on that. I mean, my love of nature is extremely selfish. I happen to like biodiversity. I think biodiversity makes my life and the life of my children potentially more interesting. I don't ever worry about nature. Nature will generate new species. It might take thousands of years, millions of years. I think what we do is a very selfish and very noble pursuit. I think we do it because we like the world as we see it, that we like this biodiversity. And therefore, I don't have to distinguish. If I think it's great to preserve it, I can preserve it whether we're responsible or not. You know, I always make that people put out this, people who are not interested in preserving biodiversity, I don't think they see it as a selfish pursuit. They see it as some other noble pursuit that, you know, nature's out there. But it's not that. We're preserving the world for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. That's why, at least I do it. I think most of us do it. And therefore, it makes answering some of those questions easy. But I think the bigger question is that, you know, why do we do this? Nature will be here. There'll be nature here. It might be a lot less species. We might be cities of crows and rats. Nature's here. Nature's cockroaches. There'll be lots of things. There'll be lots of nature. There'll be new species that evolve. Maybe the pigeons and the rats and the crows will interbreed. It'll be great. But the bottom line is it will be here. Nature's not going anywhere. And I think that's the thing. But what kind of nature will it be? So I think that goes back, you know, if we like to keep things, you know, regardless of whether we're responsible or not, don't we want a biodiverse world?